My twin brother appeared at my door, covered in bruises. His wife's brothers had been beating him for a year. So, we switched place and I made sure they'd never forget it. The clock on my wall showed exactly 2:17 de la mañana when the knocking started, and it wasn't normal knocking like when a friend visits or a delivery person arrives. It was desperate and weak, like someone using their very last bit of strength to make contact with the wooden door. And I remember lying in bed hearing that sound and feeling my heart start pounding in my chest, because living alone in the city, late night visitors almost always meant trouble of some kind. So I stumbled out of bed wearing just my old t-shirt and sweatpants and walked toward the front door with cautious steps, and through the peephole I could see a figure hunched over in the darkness, but I couldn't make out the face because the porch light had burned out 2 days ago and I kept forgetting to replace it. So I took a deep breath and opened the door slowly, and the man standing there lifted his head, and in that moment I stopped breathing completely, because it was like looking into a broken mirror, and my twin brother Marcus stood there on my doorstep, but not the Marcus I knew and loved, because this Marcus had a swollen left eye that was nearly shut and a split lip still oozing blood, and bruises covering both of his arms in various shades of purple and yellow and green, showing they were from different times, and his white shirt was stained with fresh blood and old blood mixed together. And he looked at me with eyes that were identical to my own but held something I had never seen in them before, which was complete and total defeat. And he whispered my name, saying Daniel. I didn't know where else to go, and then before I could respond or ask any questions he collapsed forward into my arms, and I caught him just before he hit the ground and noticed immediately that he weighed much less than I remembered from our last meeting 6 months ago. And I dragged him inside and locked the door behind us and laid him gently on my couch, and under the bright living room lights the damage looked even worse than it had in the darkness. He made Marcus hot tea with honey the way our mother used to make it when we were sick as children, and I noticed that he couldn't hold the cup steady because his hands were shaking so badly from the trauma and the exhaustion and the fear. So I held the cup for him and helped him take small sips, and between those sips the story came out piece by painful piece, like pulling broken glass from a wound. And Marcus had married Samantha 3 years ago in a beautiful ceremony with white flowers and string music, and everyone who attended said they were the perfect couple destined for happiness. But what nobody saw at that wedding was the darkness lurking beneath the surface of Samantha's family, and specifically her 3 older brothers named Victor and Roman and Joseph, who were built like trucks from years of construction work and mean like snakes with cold calculating eyes. And Marcus told me that it started small at first with just comments about how he wasn't man enough for their precious sister, and how he didn't make enough money to provide for her properly, and how he didn't deserve someone as beautiful and special as Samantha. And I remembered those brothers from the wedding day and how they had stared at Marcus like he was an insect that had wandered into their home. And Marcus continued saying that one night about a year ago Victor showed up at their house unannounced and said that Marcus had disrespected Samantha by coming home late from work even though Marcus had called ahead and explained about the traffic. And Victor said that calling wasn't good enough and that a real man would have found a way. And then Marcus paused and his hand went to his ribs instinctively, and he told me that Victor beat him in his own living room while Samantha watched from the kitchen doorway, and she didn't stop her brother, and she didn't even look surprised by what was happening. And I asked Marcus why he didn't call the police after that first beating, and he laughed bitterly and explained that Marcus slept for 14 hours straight on my couch wrapped in blankets while his body tried to recover from months of accumulated trauma and abuse. And during those hours I sat in my kitchen drinking coffee and thinking and planning, because these brothers were clearly powerful in their territory with connections to law enforcement and the legal system. And Marcus was right that going to their local police would be completely useless and probably dangerous, but I wasn't without resources of my own, because I worked as a security consultant for major corporations, and I was former military with training in surveillance and evidence gathering, and I knew exactly how systems worked and how evidence could be collected and how to build an airtight case that couldn't be dismissed or buried. And I also had something else that Victor and Roman and Joseph didn't know about, because they had never met me, and Marcus and I were identical twins with the same height and the same face and the same voice. And growing up even our own parents confused us sometimes. And Marcus had mentioned that his wife's family lived 4 hours away from where he and Samantha had settled down, and the brothers only visited for their weekly sessions, and they had never been to our hometown and never met any of our extended family. And to them Marcus was an only child with no one to protect him. And Samantha knew about me, of course, but Marcus said something important, which was that she never talked to her brothers about personnel details, because to them Marcus was just her husband and they didn't care about his background or his family. And an idea began forming in my mind that was crazy and dangerous but maybe brilliant. And when Marcus finally woke up, I was sitting beside his bed waiting, and I asked him important questions about whether the beatings followed a pattern, and he confirmed they happened every Saturday evening around 7 de la tarde at the house, and Samantha always made sure he was home. And I asked if they would break. The first rule I learned in military training was to always secure your legal protection before taking any action that could be considered dangerous or controversial. So on Monday morning I called Jennifer Walsh, who was a criminal defense attorney and former prosecutor that I had worked with on a corporate security case about 2 years ago, and I told her I needed a consultation that would be off the record first and then potentially on the record depending on how things developed. And she told me To come to her office at 2 de la tarde, and her office was located in a tall building downtown and it was all glass and steel and looked professional and intimidating, which was perfect for what we needed, and I brought Marcus with me even though he was nervous and still flinching at sudden movements and loud sounds, and Jennifer listened to the entire story from beginning to end without interrupting even once, and she took detailed notes on a yellow legal pad and her face remained completely neutral throughout the whole telling. And when Marcus finished describing everything that had happened to him over the past year, Jennifer set down her pen and looked at him with compassion and told him that first she was sorry this happened and that domestic abuse against men is severely underreported and often dismissed by society, but that he was not alone and he was definitely not weak for enduring what he endured, and Marcus's eyes watered at hearing those words from a professional who believed him. And Jennifer continued saying that his concerns about local police were valid because corruption does exist in law enforcement and going to compromised authorities would be dangerous and potentially make things worse, but she explained that federal law provides options and the Violence Against Women Act, despite its name, actually covers all genders and victims, and interstate domestic violence is a federal crime, and if we could prove that these men crossed state lines to assault Marcus, then it becomes battered. The next 2 weeks of my life were dedicated entirely to preparation because I knew that going up against violent men with police connections required perfect execution and zero mistakes, so the first priority was getting Marcus proper medical documentation, and I took him to 3 different doctors in 3 different cities, and each one photographed his injuries in detail from every angle, and each one wrote comprehensive reports describing what they observed, and the medical record showed old fractures that had healed incorrectly because they were never properly treated, and scar tissue from repeated trauma in the same locations, and malnutrition from the stress of living in constant fear, and the medical file grew thick with evidence of systematic abuse. And second, I focused on technology because I needed professional recording equipment that would capture clear evidence, and I purchased tiny cameras that looked exactly like ordinary shirt buttons and audio recorders disguised as pens that actually wrote, and a GPS tracker for my car in case something went wrong, and backup recording devices hidden in my shoes. And third, Marcus and I spent hours together every day so I could learn to become him perfectly, and he told me everything about his daily life, including how he walked with a slight shuffle now, and how he talked to Samantha using short sentences and avoiding eye contact, and what phrases he commonly used, and his nervous habits and his mannerisms when he was afraid. And I studied him like an actor preparing for the most important role of his career. And one day Marcus told me that I didn't slouch enough because he had developed a permanent slouch from the beatings and the psychological defeat, and I stood too straight with too much confidence, so I adjusted my posture until I could pass for a broken man, and we practiced conversations over and over, including what Victor usually said when he arrived and how Marcus typically responded. Saturday morning arrived, and the day of the switch had finally come after weeks of careful preparation, and Marcus and I stood side by side in front of my bathroom mirror looking at our identical faces staring back at us, and Marcus asked if I wanted to back out, and I told him that wasn't happening because I had committed to this plan and I was going to see it through, and I dressed carefully in Marcus's clothes and put on his watch on my left wrist exactly where he wore it, and used his cologne, which smelled different from mine, and finally I put on his wedding ring, which felt strange and wrong on my finger but necessary for the deception, and the final detail was practicing his defeated posture one more time with my shoulders slumped down and my eyes automatically avoiding direct contact and taking small hesitant steps instead of my normal confident stride, and Marcus watched me transform into him right before his eyes, and he said it was scary how good I was at becoming him, and I told him he had been a good teacher, and we hugged tightly, and I told him to stay in my apartment and not answer the door for anyone, and that I would call him when it was done. And the drive to Marcus's house took 4 hours on the highway, and I used that time to get fully into character and to suppress my natural confidence and military bearing and to become the broken defeated man that Victor and the others expected to see. And Marcus's house was in a quiet suburban neighborhood with a nice lawn and a white picket fence, and it looked picture perfect from the outside like something from a magazine, but I knew it was a prison on the inside, and I parked in the driveway and took a deep breath and activated all of my recording devices and walked to the front door. The door opened and Victor stepped inside the house, and he was even bigger than I had expected from Marcus's descriptions because he stood at least 6'4" with broad shoulders and hands that looked like sledgehammers, and his face seemed like it was made specifically for cruelty, with small dark eyes and a thick brow and a permanent sneer on his lips, and he looked at me with contempt and said, well, the rabbit came back to his hole, and Samantha moved to kiss Victor's cheek with obvious affection and told him that I had come back this morning and said I needed time away, and Victor laughed and asked if we had given Marcus permission for time away, and I kept my eyes down on the floor and my shoulders hunched forward and made my voice small and weak and apologized, saying I wasn't thinking clearly, and Victor walked closer to me and started circling me like a shark that had spotted wounded prey, and he said that 2 weeks without their lessons must have made me forget who I belonged. When I was recording everything and needed to keep him talking, so I said quietly that I hadn't forgotten anything, and Victor demanded that I tell him who owned me, and every part of my training screamed at me to fight back, but instead I forced myself to answer, saying that he owned me and his brothers owned me, and Victor smiled at Samantha with satisfaction and said that I remembered my place, and then he grabbed my shirt collar and pulled me close to his face, and his breath smelled like cigarettes and cheap alcohol, and he told me that forgetting has consequences and that tonight he was going to remind me why I should never run away again, and he shoved me backwards against the wall and told Samantha to go upstairs because this was between men, and she walked away without looking back. 60 minutes after Victor left the house I was still lying on the floor with fresh bruises forming on my body, but inside I felt triumphant because I had captured everything on my recording devices, and Samantha eventually came downstairs and looked at me lying there in pain, and she simply stepped over me like I was a piece of furniture and went to the kitchen and noticed blood on the floor tiles and told me coldly to clean it before it stained the grout, and there were no questions about with it. I was okay, and no sympathy in her voice and nothing resembling human compassion, and I got up slowly making a show of limping even though my injuries weren't as bad as they appeared, and I told her I needed to use the bathroom and she said fine, but then I needed to clean the floor, and in the bathroom I checked all of my recording devices and confirmed they were all functioning perfectly and had captured everything clearly, including Victor's voice and his confessions about the weekly beatings and his threats and his admission that Samantha had requested this treatment, and this was pure gold for our federal case. And I cleaned the floor as ordered and made dinner as expected and played the perfect victim role throughout the evening, and that night Samantha slept in the master bedroom while I slept in the guest room where Marcus had been banished, and at 3 de la mañana when the house was completely silent I gathered my things quietly and left without any confrontation because I had what I needed, and there was no point in revealing myself yet, and I drove for 2 hours before stopping at a rest area and calling Marcus to tell him that it was done and that I got everything we needed, and he started crying with relief. Monday morning arrived and I went directly to Jennifer's office with all of the recordings and documentation from Saturday night, and she reviewed the recordings 3 times and read the complete transcripts twice with careful attention to every word, and when she finished she looked up at me and said, "This is remarkable work," and I asked if it was enough evidence to proceed, and she confirmed it was more than enough because we had documented interstate travel for the purpose of domestic violence and conspiracy between family members and assault and battery and threats of murder and Samantha's direct involvement and request for the abuse, and she picked up her phone immediately and told me she had a contact at the FBI field office named Agent Williams who specialized in domestic violence cases, and one phone call later Agent Williams agreed to meet with us that very afternoon, and FBI headquarters was an intimidating building that was all business with no decoration or warmth, and Agent Williams was a small woman with sharp intelligent eyes who listened to our complete story and reviewed all of the evidence carefully, and she complimented the professional level documentation and asked who had helped us gather it, and Marcus explained that his twin brother had military training and worked as a security consultant, and Williams nodded with understanding and explained that the local police corruption actually helped our case because it could be treated as a civil rights violation as well, and she outlined what would happen next, including obtaining federal warrants and coordinating with state police outside the corrupt district and arresting all 3 brothers simultaneously in separate jurisdictions. And when Marcus asked about Samantha she confirmed that his wife would also be arrested as an accomplice for conspiracy to commit assault, and Marcus looked shocked because despite everything part of him still had feelings for the woman he had married. 2 weeks of intensive preparation followed as federal agents coordinated across 3 different states to ensure that the arrests would happen smoothly and simultaneously without giving any of the targets time to warn each other or flee. And Saturday morning finally arrived, and at exactly 7 de la mañana the raids began, and Victor was arrested at his construction company site in front of all of his workers and employees, and he screamed about his uncle the police captain, and demanded they call him, but the FBI agents just smiled and showed him their federal badges, which meant his local connections were completely worthless. And Roman was arrested at a gas station where he had stopped to fill up his truck, and when he saw the agents approaching he tried to run, but he didn't get very far before they tackled him to the ground. And Joseph was arrested at his mother's house where he had been living, and he started crying immediately and began asking about making a deal before they even finished reading his rights. And Samantha was arrested at the house where she had watched her husband be beaten week after week, and she tried calling Marcus's phone not knowing that I had answered it, and she demanded to know what he had done and what he had told them, and I spoke in my own voice instead of Marcus's voice and introduced myself as Daniel and explained that I was Marcus's twin brother and the one she never bothered to learn about, and I told her that the men she tortured had a family and a brother who don't tolerate bullies, and that she and her brothers had picked the wrong victim, and I hung up while she was still screaming. And that afternoon all 4 of them were arraigned on federal charges with Victor, and Roman denied bail entirely, and the corrupt uncle tried to intervene, but his local power meant nothing against federal authority. The trial preparation process took several months as lawyers on both sides gathered evidence and took depositions and filed motions, and during that extended time many dark secrets began emerging from the shadows because it turned out that Marcus was not Victor's only victim, and 3 other men came forward to share their own stories of abuse, and 2 of them were ex-boyfriends of Samantha who had been beaten by her brothers for perceived disrespect, and one was the husband of another sister in the family who had endured similar weekly sessions, and the pattern was identical across all cases, with the same systematic abuse and the same threats to keep silent and the same isolation from family and friends and Victor's own ex-wives. Both testified about being beaten during their marriages and being threatened into silence after their divorces, and the case grew much larger than anyone had initially anticipated, and what started as one man's nightmare revealed a pattern of organized family violence spanning at least 15 years, and Jennifer brought in additional lawyers to help handle the expanded case, and it became a federal landmark that would be studied in law schools. And Marcus testified via video link because he couldn't face his abusers in person, and nobody blamed him for that choice, and his testimony was incredibly powerful as he described every bruise and every threat and every Saturday session in painful detail, and the jury watched the recordings I had made and heard. Victor's own voice saying this is your life now and every Saturday until I decide otherwise, and his own words convicted him more effectively than any witness could have, and Samantha tried to claim she was afraid of her brothers, but the recordings showed no fear in her voice, only anticipation. Verdict day arrived after months of testimony and evidence presentation and closing arguments, and the courtroom was packed with media and observers and family members of all the victims who had come forward, and the jury filed in and took their seats, and the judge asked if they had reached verdicts, and the foreperson stood and said they had, and for Victor the verdict was guilty on all counts, and the sentence was 15 years in federal prison with no possibility of early parole, and for Roman, the verdict was guilty on all counts, and the sentence was 12 years in federal prison, and for Joseph, who had cooperated with prosecutors, the verdict was guilty on reduced charges, and the sentence was 5 years in federal prison, and for Samantha the verdict was guilty of conspiracy and being an accessory to assault, and the sentence was 8 years in federal prison, and the corrupt uncle was investigated separately, and he lost his badge and faced his own criminal charges for obstruction of justicia, and 15 years of violence and 4 years of specific abuse against Marcus had all ended in that one courtroom on that one day, and Marcus watched the sentencing on television from my apartment because he still couldn't bring himself to be in the same room as his abusers, and when Victor was led away in chains and handcuffs, Marcus finally smiled, a genuine smile that I hadn't seen on his face in years, and he asked me if it was really over, and I confirmed that they would be in prison for years and couldn't hurt him or anyone else ever again, and he looked at his hands which were no longer shaking and said he had forgotten what it felt like to not be afraid. The cavity from years of systematic abuse wasn't instant, and Marcus understood that healing would be a long journey with many difficult days ahead, and he started therapy sessions twice a week, at first working with a psychologist who specialized in trauma and abuse survivors, and then as he made progress the sessions reduced to once a week and eventually to monthly check-ins, and the trauma didn't magically disappear, but it evolved and changed shape, and some days were harder than others, and some nights brought terrible nightmares that woke him up screaming, but the overall trajectory was definitely upward and moving toward health, and he filed for divorce from Samantha, and she signed the papers from her prison cell because she had no choice, and no leverage, and the house they had shared was sold, and Marcus wanted nothing from that life, and he moved to my city and got an apartment just 2 blocks away from mine and found a new job at a company that valued him, and slowly piece by piece he rebuilt himself into the man he was meant to be, and he did physical therapy to help heal his old injuries that had never been properly treated, and he joined social activities to rebuild his confidence and learn to trust people again, and he found support groups for male abuse survivors where he discovered he wasn't alone in his experience, and our mother eventually learned the full truth about what had happened, and she cried for 3 days straight and kept asking why Marcus hadn't told her. Because she would have helped him somehow, and I explained that he was protecting her because they had threatened to hurt her, and she called them monsters and hugged Marcus for an hour without letting go, and 1 year after the trial Marcus stood straighter and smiled easier and laughed sometimes. 2 years after Victor received his sentence and began serving his time in federal prison, I received an unexpected letter in my mailbox, and the return address showed it came from the correctional facility where Victor was incarcerated, and I opened it carefully and read the words he had written, which said that he knew now and that he knew it wasn't really Marcus that night, and that he knew I had tricked him because his lawyer had finally told him about Marcus's twin brother, and he asked if I thought I was smart and if I thought I had one, and then he made a direct threat saying that he would remember my face and that when he got out of prison he would find me and he would find both of us, and that this wasn't over yet, and I read the letter twice and felt no fear because Victor was behind bars and powerless, and I showed the letter to Jennifer, who smiled and explained that this was a threatening communication made in writing from prison, and it constituted threatening a witness and conspiracy to commit harm, and we filed an official complaint with the prison authorities and federal prosecutors, and Victor's upcoming parole hearing was immediately cancelled, and his sentence was extended by 5 years because of his own stupid decision to send that letter, and some people simply don't learn from their mistakes no matter how severe the consequences, and Victor was clearly one of those people, and he never wrote another letter after that because he finally understood that every action he took only made his situation worse, and his power was completely gone, and his connections were worthless, and his freedom was gone for at least another 2 decades, and he could threaten all he wanted from his prison cell, but he could never hurt anyone ever again. 5 years had passed since that terrible night when Marcus appeared at my door covered in bruises, and it was a Sunday evening, and we were having dinner at Marcus's new apartment, and gathered around the table were Marcus and his wonderful girlfriend, Elena, who he had met at a support group for abuse survivors, and our mother, who was healthy and happy, and me and my wife Sarah, who I had married 2 years earlier, and the table was full of food and laughter and love, and Marcus stood up and raised his glass and asked everyone to listen for a moment, and he said that 5 years ago he showed up at his brother's door broken and defeated and ready to give up on life entirely, and Elena held his hand supportively as he continued, and he said that today he had a life he never thought was possible, including a woman who truly loved him and a family that supported him unconditionally and a future that didn't terrify him anymore, and he looked directly at me and said that I had saved his life and not used his physical body but his soul and his spirit and his ability to believe in goodness, and he said that I showed him he wasn't alone and that he deserved to be protected and that the abuse didn't define who he was as a person, and if anyone watching this or hearing this story was going through something similar, he wanted them to know that there is help available and there is hope even in the darkest moments, and there are people who will fight for you, and we all raised our glasses and drank too. Second chances and the family and the never giving up, and after dinner Marcus and I stood on his balcony looking at the city lights, and he said the past was finally behind us and the future was bright, and the monsters who tried to destroy him would spend decades in prison knowing they had underestimated the power of family and love. Sometimes, the real victory is not letting yourself lose, even if the other person wins with a laugh. If you've ever felt something like this, please let me know in the comments. I read every comment. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like. Don't forget to share it with someone close to you, they might need to hear it too. And if you want to hear more such real stories, subscribe to the channel. See you in the next story.